So let's talk about jobs for the different kinds of minds. My kind of mind, skilled trades, art, animals. Now, the thing that worries me about art is AI. Hands-on jobs will not be taken over by AI. All kinds of skilled trade stuff, design work, working with animals. Now, the mathematical minds, computers. Well, there's going to be some computer programming stuff that's going to get taken over. Video game design, forget it. AI is going to eat that one alive. But the skilled trade stuff, it's totally safe from AI.
Why knowledge matters. Welcome, I'm your host, Yannick, and now joining me, Professor Temple Grandin. Professor Temple Grandin is a distinguished professor of animal sciences at Colorado State University. She holds various honorary doctorates, successful author of more than 12 books. Also, her life has been filmed and made a movie and won Grammy Awards on HBO. She's named one of Times Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world, induction into the Academy of Arts and Sciences, inducted in the National Women's Hall of Fame, champion of livestock handling systems and animal welfare, and entrepreneur. Welcome, Professor Temple Grandin, to be on the show. It's such an honor to have you here. You have influenced, I guess, more than anyone else. The changes that you were able to bring for livestock, but also for people with autism, is tremendous. So welcome to the show, Temple Grandin. It's such an honor.
It's great to be here.
Let's start. Who is Temple Grandin in one sentence?
Well, I like to find practical solutions to improve conditions, both for animals and for autistic people. Just practical information that educators, parents can go out and use, practical stuff that ranchers can go out and use, and not very much theory. But I base my practical suggestions on theories. But you want to get stuff done in the field, it's got to be practical.
When you can just use one word to define Temple Grandin and one picture, what will it be?
I don't know. I don't think that way.
What's your day routine in general? When do you get up and how does it look like an ordinary day?
Things have changed over the years. When I first started, when I was in my 20s, my work was all on equipment. I thought if I could have the perfect equipment, it would almost self-manage itself. A lot of engineers make that mistake. I made that mistake. And then I realized that equipment's only half the equation. You have to operate the equipment right. So the next middle part of my career, I worked on writing animal welfare guidelines for slaughter plants. And then I worked on implementing them. Back in 1999, I had Burger King, Wendy's, and McDonald's. And McDonald's was a pioneer inspecting plants using a very simple scoring system I devised. Very, very simple. 5 of the most important things to measure. And when you have a big company enforcing that, I saw more improvement than I'd seen in my whole career prior to that. I had a lot of equipment out in the field that people tore up and wrecked, but now they were forced to manage it. You know, I'm way past retirement age. So the main thing I'm doing right now is doing talks to students on autism and animal welfare, both. A lot of speaking engagements, lots of Zoom calls. I had to learn how to do that during COVID. So kind of my career went from equipment designer to animal welfare implementer out in the field. Now I want to help tomorrow's leaders to get started.
And what's also very interesting, ultimately, and that's very usual in outstanding people, you also become ultimately a public intellectual, really, throughout the whole world. But now let's touch a little bit more on your biography. In hindsight, was your autism or neurodiversity a blessing considering your outstanding life?
Well, I'm an extreme visual thinker. You see, I don't think verbally. I think in pictures. Everything I think about is a picture. Verbal thinkers are very top down. My thinking is bottom up. So let's take interventions that can help autistic students in schools. Well, there's some very, very simple things. After going to tons of meetings, talking to lots of people, it's very important for them, since there's working memory issues, and I have them. Any task that involves a sequence, give them a pilot's checklist step by step. Make sure the LED lights don't flicker by checking in with slow motion video. That's another thing. Getting bullying under control. I was called all kinds of names in high school. So those are 3 very specific things you could do to help that autistic student in the classroom. But they're specific, but they're based on the same things. In food safety, we call them critical control points. I cannot remember long strings of verbal information. I need to write it down. I need an external working memory.
Your mother also was very important because she did not treat you as a victim or something that needs to be helped. So how important was your mother to your success?
Took me to a neurologist who recommended 2 speech therapy teachers that worked out of a small house. So I got very good early education. She had a very good sense of how much to kind of push me. She also taught me to read when I was age 8. I could not read by age 8. I was fully verbal by 4. And she just taught me to read out loud with phonics, and we read a book like The Wizard of Oz, a book that would be fun to read. That's our generation's Harry Potter. And she just taught me to sound out my words, because sight words didn't work for me. I had great elementary school teachers in a small school. I was a bad high school student. I wasn't interested until my science teacher got me interested in studying so I could become a scientist. So I want to really credit my mother and some very good mentors and teachers that I had.
Now, a little bit an obvious question. Where did you learn to dress so classy and uniquely? I love your style.
Well, it kind of came gradually. I always liked Western. And then I just started kind of wearing these shirts, and I go, well, I'm just going to wear them all the time then. And I have, like, this is my dress version right now. It's very cold, below 0 here right now. I've got electric heat. It does not work very well. I've got 3 shirts on under this because I'm right by a cold sliding glass door right now that's covered up with a curtain. So there's 3 shirts under this. The electric heating in my house does not work very well. And
so you're also your trajectory of your life, and especially also due to also your mother, of course, your family, is, in 3 words, I would say exploration and exposure, which really ultimately turned into the curiosity and really forged the innate ability that you had, but somehow was disregarded in school. Would you agree with this assessment?
I don't know. You see, I think you're a very verbal person. You see, everything I think about is a picture. And one of the things that helped me in my work with cattle when I first started is I looked at what cattle were seeing, going to a chute maybe to be vaccinated or even at the meat plant, and they'd stop at a shadow. They'd stop at a reflection. They'd stop at a piece of chain hanging down, a shirt hung on a fence. Little things we tend to not notice. You see, in being an extreme visual thinker, in fact, I talk about visual thinking in my book, Visual Thinking, Hidden Gifts of People Who Think in Pictures, Patterns, and Abstractions. Now, one of the problems with visual thinkers cannot do abstract math. I have to have a picture graphics file in order to remember something. Now, the interesting thing is, in all my equipment work, I have a lot of equipment still out in the industry, even though a lot of it I developed 30 years ago, it's still out there in the industry. Some of the people who invented some stuff for me and built it were probably autistic. Brilliant metal workers that just could invent machines. And this is something I'm very concerned right now, is these people are retiring out. I just hope our power plant doesn't fail. My house would freeze solid. And the visual thinkers are the kind of people that are going to keep the lights on, keep the waterworks going, and they're retiring out. So that's another big thing I've been really talking about. And I've talked to a lot of different industries, and that kind of autistic, weird guy in the shop that they really need is retiring out and not getting replaced.
So that's a huge problem, and we will actually dive into this a little bit later. Now, just a personal question. You grew up in a Christian home, so did you go regularly, for example, to church, and how did it influence you, and how is it today?
Well, yes, I did grow up. And the things that influenced me in church were practical things. And one of the things we did in our church, this was in the 50s, is each child had to give a Christmas present for a poor child. And they put all the presents in a big manger up by the altar and said it's better to give than to receive. That made an impression on me. Concrete, real things.
Your life is really a testimony of incredible faith. So, how were you able to hold on despite the bullying that you faced, in the school? So, what is it particular about you? Is it something innate or something that you got somehow nurtured that you turned from adversity really into a opportunity, because
Well,
it forged this outstanding person that we know throughout the world?
well, I had my high school science teacher, and we had interesting things we did with him, like the Model Rocket Club. This is a place where I was not bullied. The other big thing was horses. You might want to look at a paper that's open access, how horses help the teenager with autism make friends and learn how to work. Riding horses and preparing horses for shows was one place where I was not bullied. This brings up friends through shared interests. And the kids that were interested in horses, interested in model rockets or electronic circuits, the bullies were not interested in those things. So I had some places where I could get away from this. That's really important. The other thing is I learned how to work. Even though I was a horrible student, I got kicked out of 9th grade for throwing a book at a girl. She called me a retard. And I chucked a great big social studies book at her, hit her on the head with it. And I went to a special boarding school, and they put me to work running the horse barn. And I cleaned 9 stalls every day, put them in and out, fed them. I was very proud of the fact that I did that, but I learned working skills. And one of the big problems I'm seeing today on the fully verbal end of the spectrum, kids are not learning working skills. They're not learning life skills, like shopping. I had little bits of allowance, and I was shopping and learning how to save money when I was 7, 8, and 9 years old. That's not happening today. Work skills are not the same as academic skills. Too many parents overprotect when I suggested when they're like pumping some gas at the gas station, have your kid run in the shop and buy something. And so I've had parents say, I can't let go. And I'm talking about something as innocently as buying a jug of milk at a gas station store where you're right there looking in the window. You see, I see it. I even see which gas station I'd do it at, which pump I'd go to, where I could see into the shop. And it's in a really good neighborhood, too. I see it. You see, it's specific. There's nothing abstract about it.
And you know what I also love? I mean, by the way, I also love horseback riding. That is just so outstanding, and horses are just beautiful. It's just, but on the other hand, it's also not very accessible. It's also very, very expensive. But what you just said is one of the biggest problem we face today is people are so caught up with their screens. And I see it myself.
Oh, we got to get them off that. We got to get them off the screens. And that's why I've got these books like Calling All Minds, My Childhood Projects, Making Kites. I have another book called The Outdoor Scientist. Let's just get kids observing animals, looking at stars, looking at different plants, get them outside. We've got to get them off the screens. Now, I'm not suggesting banning it. Let's do what we did in the 50s. I was allowed 1 hour of television a day, 2 hours of television on the weekend. We can do that same thing with video games. You limit it. You don't ban it. You limit it.
I 100% agree, but the problem is too that the parents themselves are addicted to it, And
Well,
then
you see, we had I've talked to a lot, and I'm very sorry I interrupt. This is part of my problem with processor speed. I can't time, and I know it's rude, and I can't help it. But the
I
other thing,
love that. I actually love that because you know why? You are super authentic, you are real. I love that. And it doesn't bother me at all. That is why you are such an impactful person, because you are truly who you are meant to be. That's why you impact lives, because you're authentic to the core. Your integrity, everything you do is because it comes from a place from your heart, I would say, or
I
from your
want
brain or whatever.
I'm seeing grandmothers come up to me to find out they're autistic. They're on the fully verbal end of the spectrum. When the kids get diagnosed, why did that grandfather get a good job? Because he had a paper route at age 11. Now, I know those are gone now. I know that. So now we have to find paper route substitutes. Walking a neighbor's dog. It's very important that they do a task on a schedule for a boss that's outside the home. Church volunteer jobs. Just a few months ago, I talked to a 12-year-old. She was the church coffee lady, autistic. Very proud of that. Okay, these are very simple. These don't cost anything to do. I'm trying to always pick out good low-income options. And doing coffee at a church is something you can implement. Doesn't cost anything. And it can be just done in the neighborhood. And the young lady learned some work skills.
It is really, that's who we are meant to be, right? We were always hunter-gatherers, right? And when we move our bodies, there's just a different chemicals in our brain. We change it, and that's why it is so important, that we have this. And as you said, working, doing something, it's just meaningful. It connects us to people, it connects us to the world, right? And especially with animals, it's also so calming. We know the important impact it has.
Well, I've talked to a lot of people that have had, like bad childhoods and whatever. And the thing that saved them was to have a person that was a safe person. It might be a shop teacher, it might be clergy, it might be the next door neighbor, but some safe havens where they can get away from it. And I did have, even though I was bullied when I came in the cafeteria or walked across the parking lot, they would call me tape recorder and bones, because I always would use the same phrases. I didn't know why they were calling me tape recorder, but I do now.
Who shaped who? Was it your personality, who you are, who shaped your career, or was it ultimately more your career who shaped who become? How did this
people ask
play
me,
out?
well, how did I get involved with cattle? I got exposed to them as a teenager. I want to emphasize the importance of exposing students to lots of different things, so then they have a chance to gravitate towards what they might be good at. Michelangelo was a 12-year-old school dropout, but he was exposed to great art in the churches. He knew how to use stone cutting tools, and then he started making things, and then he was apprenticed into a studio. So it starts out with exposure, then mentoring. So my boarding school had a little 12-cow dairy. I learned to milk cows there. And then when I was 15, went out to my aunt's ranch in Arizona and got introduced to beef cattle. So that is exposure. See, if I hadn't gone out to that ranch, it would not have happened.
But then too, it's still a leap. Then ultimately it brought you into the cattle industry. And imagine you were a woman in a highly male-dominated area too. So how was this, this transition that you ultimately, made a career out of it? How did this unfold?
Well, I started out writing for our state farm magazine, and there were some women in ag journalism. And I went to a cattle event, and the editor was there. And I walked up to him, and I got his card. And then my very first article is kind of a synopsis of my master's thesis on cattle handling and squeeze shoes. And I very quickly got a reputation. Now, when I covered the cattle feeders meeting, I summarized speeches real accurately. Now, there were some good people in the cattle industry. And where I got all the pushback on being a woman was middle management, foremans. foremans, where the big owners, for the most part, were good to me. And the people working just on the front lines were good to me. Being a woman was a much bigger barrier than being autistic. But then when I designed some big projects when I was in my 20s, and I wrote about them in national cattle magazines. You see, I wrote about it. Now, in that part of my career, I thought I could make self-managing systems, but I would put the drawings and stuff in national cattle magazines. And I recognized what that would do.
And also, this is also very important because you mentioned too that sometimes if you want to start or figure something out, start really at the very beginning. You go to KFC or McDonald's and you just start working your way up. But there too,
doing anything with McDonald's in the 70s when I started, I was all about designing equipment, and then I'd write about it. You know, I've seen a lot of teachers do a lot of innovative stuff with the schools, but they never write about it. Now look back on now a 50-year career, writing was a very important thing, because instead of holding on to my intellectual property, I wrote about it. And then I got plenty of consulting work. And now I've taken my book money and my speaking engagement money. I've put 22 graduate students through school, masters and PhDs. I have 3 PhDs as professors now in 3 different universities that were my students. That's what I do with the book money and the speaking money.
That is unbelievable, what you have done. I mean, and it is also so interesting that what you said, it's really also, you have to start somewhere, right? And instead of just keeping your thoughts for yourself, you just started producing, you started contributing really to the world, right? And I think this is too, if you have a talent somehow, just start actually applying it. If you're young, just start somewhere.
In the HBO movie Temple Grandin, there's a scene in there where I go up and I get the editor's card. That's a very important scene. I actually did it. The Temple Grandin movie also shows how I think visually. That's accurate, and the projects are accurate. But a lot of people don't have the guts to go up and get the card and then produce a good article. I called it the back door. And I very, very early on, they saw the back doors and I used them.
How do you respond to people who say the cattle industry is actually one of our problems that we face these days, especially in terms of the contribution to climate change, let's say? How do you respond?
Well, this is my brand new Nature that just came in the mail the other day. Read it for breakfast. There's an article in there about methane production from rice paddies, and that the more productive they are, the more methane they put out. Well, there's a place for grazing. And I've got this paper right here. It's an open access paper. Grazing cattle, sheep, and goats is an important part of a sustainable agricultural future. Now, in eastern Colorado, for example, I live right at the Front Range in the middle of Colorado, but you drive out east on I-70 out past the airport, you've got land out there that can only be grazed. The only way you can raise food on 20% of the land is a grazing animal of some sort. I don't care if it's bison, cattle, sheep, goats. And what do you do with that land? I was just out there this summer. Somebody tried to plant corn on it, and it didn't even come up to my waist at harvest time. That's not the place to plant corn. So there's a place for grazing animals. So in this article, I reviewed, and this is showing up backwards here, I reviewed a whole lot of studies on regenerative grazing, where you kind of bunch the cattle in, make them mow the grass, then they move on. And if you do this right, you can actually improve the land, because a lot of this land evolved with grazing. The other thing is using grazing animals on cover crops interspersed with other crops like corn and soy. You can improve the soil and reduce the N runoff. Now, if you start doing these things, it takes 2 to 4 years to start to see the benefits. But grazing done right, even though they do put out methane, and there may be ways to reduce that, but we got to put it in perspective. Brand new article in Nature here. Maybe I can find it in here now. Just read it this morning. I also had found some of the other stuff on rice paddies. But the thing is, what do you do with 20% of the land? What do you do with eastern Colorado? Not raise food on it? And you see a lot of people are doing all this theoretical stuff. I have physically been in every rural area of North America, winter and summer, traveling, extensive travel. Went to the outback of Australia. You've got almost as big as the whole United States. You've got an area where there's only one way to raise food on that, a grazing animal of some sort. And they may be part of the solution to the problem. Now, the way I look at it, you don't get rid of cattle and you don't get rid of rice either. We are doing research right here. My colleagues are doing research here called the Ag Next Project. They're working on ways to reduce methane in cattle. And it might even be breeding. It might work. They're working on it. The results right now are so preliminary, I don't even want to try to tell them. Papers are not published yet. But they're finding some cattle put out a lot less methane than others.
How does it make you feel sometimes when there are always these extreme views that are, completely out of balance, that people say, well, it's a problem if you do this and that. How does it make you feel sometimes? Do you get sometimes frustrated or don't?
Well, the way I look at it is there's certain issues. I call it if the potato's too hot, you drop it. And there's certain issues I'm not even going to discuss because the potato's too hot. Because if I get pulled into that blast furnace, then I can't work on stuff I'm interested in. What I'm interested right in now, sustainable ag, I'm extremely interested in. I'm also extremely interested in helping autistic kids and these other neurodiverse kids that are different to do really productive stuff, to get into good careers. And so other stuff that's a big, gigantic hot potato, I just don't touch it.
One thing I sometimes think is, for example, farmers. It's such a beautiful profession, to care about animals and just because you are part of literally nurturing people, lives. It's so essential. And so, but on the other hand, it's also usually they do not get compensated, in my view. I see it, for example, in Switzerland, a dairy farmer can barely make a living. That is huge. That's a huge problem, and that to me doesn't really make sense. How can we make sure that farmers get compensated? Because there's nothing more important, but also it is so demanding. A farmer, I know one of the
things, you see, I have no abstract thinking. And one of the problems now when you're a verbal thinker, and I discuss that in my visual thinking book, is top-down, big concepts. Well, you don't even know where to start. When I started out, it was cattle handling, something relatively targeted. And when in the beginning I thought I could fix it all with equipment, and then I learned that you can only fix half of it with equipment, and then you got to teach people how to handle cattle right. There's been a lot of people doing that, but what I've done is I've written about it. There's easy how-to directions, but I worked on cattle handling. Okay, if you want to work on farmers getting compensated, be a lot more specific. You're going to be a lot more effective. And you see, visual thinking's not abstract. Now, what's happening right now, I just was in Virginia, right outside of D.C. Get off a plane at the airport in D.C., drive 2 hours out in the countryside. And one of the big problems right now is that young people are interested in farming. The land's too expensive. They can't get into it. And that's a problem because I've seen some really motivated young people wanting to do regenerative agriculture and other really good things. And that's a big problem. Okay, but again, that's something specific. You see, you're going to do a lot more good if you picked out something specific. How can we get young people that want to start out in farming and agriculture onto the land? That's not abstract. And I'm thinking back to a specific trip that I just did a month ago. It's amazing. You landed at the airport in D.C., 2 hours later, you're in the countryside.
And this is also part of your success because that is what goal setting and everything does, is like specific, small things start somewhere, but it starts and you start making the ball rolling, and then you can actually start changing things that you think are important. So it's
Well,
so
the other
important,
thing
especially for
is
young people.
little guys innovate. I don't care what industry it is. Take ChatGPT, for example. Little guys innovate. A single graduate student figured out how to take 2 graphics card computer game circuit boards that they bought on Amazon for a few $100s to figure out how to do the first neural net for artificial intelligence. Probably the most important package Amazon ever shipped. One little guy, encouraged by his professor's paper, has 120,000 citations. And then the company that did ChatGPT was bought out by Microsoft. But little guys innovate. It doesn't matter what industry it is. That's something I've found out from all the years.
What is it specifically that you were able, since the 80s, to bring about fundamental changes in the cattle and livestock industry?
I wrote about. Writing was a very important part of my career. There's a lot of other people doing some great stuff with cattle, but nothing's written up. Nothing's written up. I was just with a really great teacher yesterday out in Elko, Nevada, doing great stuff. You're going to have to write about it. Just practical how-to articles. And I wrote a lot of those on cattle handling. And nobody else was. You see, in the beginning, I was a pioneer in that. There's other people now doing cattle handling, but they're not that good at writing. You see, my first job was livestock editor for the Arizona Farmer Ranchman magazine. That was important. Getting that card, that scene in that movie is absolutely real.
But it's also fascinating because a lot of academics, they do the writing, but they do not do the how-to. They just do why or abstract, right? And that's a difference from you.
And trying to cross that gap. And I've got some papers online. And right now I'm paying a lot of money to get papers open access. Some of my old stuff is behind a paywall. I've put it up on some of it up on my webpage. It might be an old HTML, but it's there. But the writing was really important, and crossing the divide between the practical world and academia. That's a difficult divide to cross, because then they say, well, you're writing it too, not formal enough. Yep, that's an issue. But I would write in the academic press. You see, and that work's been preserved. All the things I wrote for Beef magazine in the 70s, it didn't make it to online because everything was pre-internet. But I wrote a lot of articles just for what's called industry trade magazines. You see, I wrote both in the academic and in industry trade.
But it's also amazing, and now we are actually at your book, about your book, Visual Thinking, an outstanding book that I recommend to everyone to read. So I couldn't put it down. It's so enlightening. But also, you are a visual thinker, so you're an object visual thinker, right? And so you were still able to actually write, because this is more verbal thinking, right? Writing is more verbal thinking. So how were you able to bridge that?
Well, the words narrate the pictures. So what we did when we did the visual thinking book, Betsy Lerner was a super good co-author. She's a total verbal thinker. So I do rough drafts of a chapter, and she'd smooth them all out. So that's working together with complementary skills. That's something that's really important. But another problem I'm worried about now is us visual thinkers can't do algebra. I don't think I could graduate from high school today. I had to major in psychology because I had to dodge the math classes. But the thing is, the engineers need us. Because what I found working in the meat industry, I don't care which company I worked for, you had the clever engineers in the shop that were patenting and inventing equipment. And then the mathematical engineers would do boilers and refrigeration because we don't understand that stuff. But you have to have both. And the clever engineers are retiring out. The shops were shut down 20 years ago. But you know what's happening now? One of the major meat companies just bought 2 machine shops. But how are they going to get them populated with new mechanics where those kids are playing video games in the basement when they should be inventing equipment. There's a link here. I've just watched the whole Boeing mess. This big mess here. Look at this article here. Boeing manufacturing mess. And that door came off because someone didn't tighten the bolts on it. Well, they laid off a ton of people during COVID. And then 20 years ago, they sold that fuselage factory used to belong to Boeing. They sold it to private equity. And then I found out about loose rudder bolts. I don't know how you can steer the plane if the rudder fell off. It's worse than that door. But it parallels what went on with the meat industry. In the short term, that made money. In the long term, it's a disaster. And I also wrote about the Boeing Max mess with the angle of attack sensor. I sat next to a Boeing engineer on a plane after the book was published and found out that the shop guys warned the engineers about the angle of attack sensor, and they were just fluffed off.
So let's dive a little bit into the details. Like, give us like the difference between a object visual thinker and a spatial visual thinker and a verbal thinker. Let's get this together first, and then we go more into specific, because as you said, you save lives. It is so critical, with critical infrastructure to planes and so on, right? But let's go to the book.
And I said, well, I read your book 10 years ago. My kid went to college, got a great job. Thank you so much. You helped my kids so much. I've had parents come up and tell me that. The object visualizer, everything is a picture. Everything is a picture. And abstract math is not understandable. Now, your visual spatial, this is your mathematical mind. Music and math go together. Now, with the object visualizer, art and mechanics go together. And why animals? Animals don't think in words. They're sensory-based thinkers. And then a lot of people are mixtures. But the mathematical mind thinks in patterns, not pictures. And the research, and I have a whole chapter in the book on research, shows that the two object visualizer and the visual spatial mathematics are very different kinds of thought. Then you have verbal. Some people that think almost entirely in words. But then there are a lot of people that are mixtures of the different kinds of minds. But you get a kid with a label, like autism, for example. You might get an extreme object visualizer, but you can also get an autistic extreme mathematician who figured out how to make video game graphic chipboards that they bought from Amazon be the basis of artificial intelligence. When I read that, I'm going, wow. He was in his childhood bedroom in his parents' house running up the power bill. Yeah, and of course what he did in 2012 is obsolete now. But it was a different way of, he was an expert programmer. His professor encouraged him. And unfortunately, he's disappeared. I can't find him. He had some jobs at Google and some other companies. And one guy, 2 video game boards. Little guys innovate. They often don't get the credit they should be getting. But that would have been an extreme mathematics thinker. And then the word thinker. Word thinkers that are real pure word thinkers totally overgeneralize. Like teachers will say to me, well, how do I teach autistic kids? Well, am I talking to a 3-year-old here? I can give you a pretty cookbook answer for that. But when they get older, if it's a bullying problem, they can't do math. Do they getting overwhelmed with all the yakety yak long strings of verbal information? What is the problem? I have to have more information. And the first thing I need to know is age. And once they get past very early childhood, are they talking? What can they do? One of the problems you get with autism is you're going from Einstein at one end of the spectrum to somebody that might have very severe epilepsy on top of it and can't dress themselves. All got the same label. That can be a problem. But some of those nonverbals can learn to type independently and communicate with typing. But you got to use a tablet. Let me tell you why. Because on a desktop or a laptop, I got to look down. Here's the keyboard down here. Print appears up here. Can't make the attention shift. Tablet. Yeah, there's all kinds of fancy things, but you can use a plain old tablet. And let me tell you, I don't care how low income the community is, you can find old tablets, maybe half broken. And if Word or text messaging works, that's all you need.
But you also mentioned, very important actually in the book, that a lot of schools actually, they screen out these object visualizers and the spatial object visualizer actually. And it's not very good.
But the first thing I tell a lot of business leaders is you have to realize different thinking exists. There are some of these educators that don't know that visual thinking exists. And when I was doing book signings for visual thinking a year ago, one of them was done at a school. And I spent an hour talking to the principal of this school about visual thinking. He didn't know what it was. See, and a lot of people are pushing the algebra because they think you need it for logical thinking. Well, what I'm suggesting is let's have some math alternatives. Business math, accounting, statistics, or geometry. I'm not suggesting totally getting out of math. But a lot of the people that I worked with, in fact, one that's got a corporate jet now, one high school welding class, and 30 years later, can't do algebra either. He's building beef plants. But when it comes to some other equipment, like state-of-the-art chip-making machine, poultry plant, pork plant, you're going to have to buy that equipment from Europe. And there's a reason for that. And it goes back to their education. In ninth grade, you can go tech route or university route. We stick our nose up too much at the tech route. But I worked with those people. They weren't just manufacturing equipment, they were inventing it. And they have a bunch of patents too, and I've looked them up.
Yeah, this is so important. I mean, it's unbelievable. It's the same like with the plumber, right? We all need these people. It's crucial. Imagine if we will not have like running toilets, that's still a lot of people are deprived.
Now you'd have typhoid if you didn't control the surge.
How can I, for example, improve my object visual thinking? How can people improve?
Well, I think on the extreme ends, it's mostly innate. And then there's a lot of people where the first thing is you have to be aware of it. That's the first thing. You just got to be aware of it. And the thing I found in learning about verbal thinkers is just how much overgeneralization there is. Okay, so politicians come out with some big general abstract theory, but how do you actually do it? Now, the object visualizer sometimes gets too much in the details, and you need some general concepts. But there's so much abstraction where I'm going to give you 3 simple things to do to help the autistic kid in the classroom. And in food safety, we'd call those critical control points. As I watched our industry go from the 80s, beef industry was a real mess in the 80s. So was the pork industry. And there was a big food poisoning. And I watched the industry change. And what they had to figure out on food safety, and I love this concept, hazard analysis, critical control points. What are the really important things to do? Okay, let's say I got to measure germ counts on meat. I can't do 100 measurements on a processing floor. I just can't. So I got to find out where are the places where you're most likely to get contaminated. That's the critical control point. So then after going to so many meetings, I'm finding this pilot's checklist is really important. Having a written checklist of sequence on sort of an external working memory. Bullying is a big problem. LED lights that flicker are a big problem. And the super crazy rapid multitasking jobs need to be avoided, like a McDonald's takeout window. That needs to be avoided. You see, and I kind of bottom-up thinking puts things like on a spreadsheet in my mind. Jobs that were lost because they didn't have a pilot's checklist on the tasks to do. Those are critical control points. What are the most important specific things to do? When I learned about the critical control points in food safety, there's so many things you can apply that to. Where is the meat most likely to get contaminated? You measure in those places.
We will come to this a little bit later, because there is so many things that you also talk about AI, and also how important it is for critical infrastructure. But now let's just go quickly on a little bit more general social media. How do you use social media, and do you think social media is to a good extent also part of the problem when it comes to people of not having really
Well,
specific
it's
things
something
that
I
they
learned
actually
about
do?
social media, and I don't post on social media. And the page I do have, they're professionally managed, and pretty much is used to advertise books and conferences. One of the problems you've got with social media is emotional, quick responses get done. And the other problem is a social media page, because I've looked up how the algorithms work, makes more money the more hits it gets on a link. More hits the ads get. And if you set the algorithm for maximum money earnings for the company that runs a social media page, you're going to get maximum garbage. These people like to read garbage. And if you cut back on some of the total, and some of the stuff's too hot potato to discuss, but some of the absolute garbage that appears on social media, the social media company will make less money. That's one of your problems. And it's quick emotional responses. And when Facebook first came out, I gave a talk at the Kansas Cattle Feeders meeting, and I said it's going to exaggerate the viewpoints of radicals on both sides of any issue.
And that's precisely what we are now. You just predicted perfectly. I mean,
it hadn't been out. It only been out a few months, and I go, it's going to exaggerate the responses of the radicals. And then the people that have more moderate views get bashed on both sides, so they go, well, I'm not walking into that blast furnace.
Give us the best 3 tools in order to accommodate and best serve object visualizer and object spatial visualizer in schools.
Well, if object visualizers, when they get to high school, I'd cut the algebra requirement, and maybe they could take business math, statistics, geometry, or accounting. I'm not saying they totally get out of math. And also, I would put all the hands-on classes back into schools. And some schools are starting to do this, because I've worked with people that had multiple patents and they had one shop class, or they'd grown up working on cars. That was the background. Now, for the mathematical kids, what you need to be doing with them is move them ahead in math. This was done with Katherine Johnson, the famous mathematician who calculated the first orbital flight and all the suborbital flights for the NASA. She was moved ahead in math. Yes, she was horribly discriminated against, but her math education was done right. She was moved ahead quickly. You don't make little math heads do boring, stupid little baby math over and over again. Move them ahead. And some of this algebra and some of this math's real verbal. No. Drag the old books out of the attic that have just math. That's what those kids eat up. Now, as an object visualizer, my mother always encouraged my art, and to do lots of different art and not just draw the same horse heads over and over again. To broaden it. I used to make all kinds of things as a kid, little kites and parachutes, tinker for hours and hours and hours. Did the adults help me on that? No. I must have made 5 different ways of making this bird kite before I got one that flew really well.
And these are precisely these things too that actually are extremely good for our mental health, because the mental health crisis is also real, you know?
You got to get kids out doing real things. I had a girl in my class about just over a year ago. My class, they do have to do a scale drawing, who had never measured anything, either with a ruler or a tape measure, had never measured anything. Totally removed from the world of the practical. Okay, you're going to be making policy about stuff tomorrow? So if you're going to be making policy about something, you need to get your butt out in the field. You may have to fly somewhere and get out in the field. You're going to have to make it less abstract because, of course, the verbal thinkers are attracted to politics.
It's so
I
important.
call it dragging the suits out of the office. Because when I started the original McDonald's audits, I took high-level executives from McDonald's, Burger King, and Wendy's on their first trips out in the field. It was like that show, Undercover Boss. I'll never forget the day when the McDonald's executive watched a skinny, half-dead dairy cow walk up the ramp right into their product and go, yeah, there's some stuff we got to do some things about.
But that's so necessary, right? Because then you can start putting things into context, what it actually
Right.
means.
But that's what you got to do. It all turns into an abstraction, hung up in bureaucracy and things like that. I mean, in the 50s, I'm 76 years old. So in the 50s, government got stuff done. We went to the moon. 60s, we built the interstate highway system. We actually did stuff.
And this is also very important because you also mentioned in the book there are many things that actually keep you awake at night, serious things. So please elaborate a little bit more on that when it comes to critical infrastructure, AI,
I
internet,
can tell
and
you how to
why
protect.
electromechanical devices are still so essential.
Yeah, you have, the way I look at it is the AI system will be hacked. The database will get contaminated. AI is only as good as its database. And if the AI system's allowed to, that runs the power plant's allowed to go search around the gutter somewhere, it's going to do something. So I'm going to assume it's going to be hacked, and I got to protect. Very expensive. Also, some equipment's dangerous, oil refineries and things like that, from either wrecking itself or doing something dangerous. And there's one way to do it, that it cannot be hacked. Okay, let's say a big turbine spins too fast. Old-fashioned RPM meter, electromechanical, shut her down. Something gets too much pressure. Old-fashioned pressure gauge, electromechanical switch, shut her down. Big water pumps can be ruined by running dry. Put a flow meter on it. Hacker-proof. It's not electronic, it's electromechanical. Goes for more than 5 seconds without water in it, shut it down. Okay, in certain chemical plants, two things mixed together to go boom, I make sure those valves, I'm going to put controls on them that are hacker-proof. I've got to protect that equipment from being damaged. Because you take some of this big equipment, it's not on the shelf. I can't buy it right away. You want to have power? There's some big equipment. And there's some stuff I know about the power grid I'm not going to discuss because I don't want to put ideas in people's heads. But there's big equipment. Okay, I talked about these water pumps. Big equipment, each one of these systems, very expensive. And if a bunch of it got damaged, I couldn't get the piece of equipment. I mean, I'm watching things like missiles shot at container ships. Yeah, that's going to be a supply chain management issue. Yeah, go around the Horn of Africa, doubles the cost of a shipping container. Yeah, I follow that kind of stuff. That big piece of equipment I might need might be on that container ship.
Absolutely.
You see, there's a relationship here, and I see it. Nothing's abstract. And I read and I read and I read and I read. So the Boeing mess is kind of similar to the mistake the beef industry made and the pork industry made, shutting down their machine shops 20 years ago. Now they're just bought 2 machine shops. I hope they'll be able to repopulate them with some youngsters that will keep them going. But you see, these things are related. Short-term profit. It's very cold here right now. If our power plant goes off, this water system's in this condo is going to freeze solid. Yeah, and I've been watching the temperature, and I've got all the doors open, what little heat I have. Door where the washing machine nook is, that's open. And it gets really cold. Said it was going to get down to 17 below zero. I've been watching the weather report because I know what the water would do, and it flood out 2 other apartments, and my apartment controls the water for 2 other apartments. I don't want something to happen. This is the kind of stuff I get concerned about.
So important, and you beautifully elaborate these problems really in this book. That's why I highly recommend the book to also get just a sense how important it is, like that we are relate to one another, we depend on each other, and we complement perfectly each
Well, and
other.
the skills complement each other, and that ought to see. I've worked with shop guys. I remember a guy, he could fix anything electrical in a plant, anything electrical genius. I'm pretty sure he was on the spectrum. Another thing that's a danger area for a lot of people on the spectrum is changing bosses. That can get really dangerous. That's where jobs are lost. I almost lost my job at the Farmer Ranchman when the magazine got sold and we got a new boss. And he thought I was really weird. But Susie, the nice lady who was probably also autistic that did all the advertising layouts back when you pasted things on paper things, said, well, Jim doesn't like you. We're going to have to get together a big scrapbook of all your articles and show them to Jim. So I learned to sell my work. And I showed Jim my articles and he gave me a raise. Sell the work. Sell the work. I'd show off my drawings. I've got some of my drawings right here that are in my book. This was in my Thinking of Pictures book right here. And I've been asked, why does the visual thinking book not have pictures? Because the publisher said they were too expensive. That's the reason why.
How does it make you feel looking back at your outstanding career?
Well, I want to help other kids to have an outstanding career. And I've talked to granddads that are grandmoms that are on the spectrum. They've had, some good careers. There's been a lot of talk about identity and stuff like that. I'm basically, career is my identity. I am what I do. And right now, I want to encourage the young ones and do talks at universities, students on animal behavior, talks to teachers about autism. And what happens with some of these parents is they get so hung up on the autism label, they don't think their kid can do anything. And they overprotect them. And I'm appalled at the number of fully verbal teenagers labeled autistic that have never gone shopping by themselves. This is ridiculous.
And that's why we have you. We have such an outstanding person who, whether when it comes to autism, to animal handling, animal sciences, behaviorism in general, outstanding. What are you most proud of?
Well, on animal welfare, I've designed a lot of equipment. I'm very proud of that. And in the 80s and early 90s, a lot of my equipment was out in the industry. And unfortunately, quite about half my clients tore stuff up and wrecked it. So the thing that made the biggest difference was getting McDonald's, Burger King, and Wendy's, all three of those in a single year, and I trained them, enforcing the same simple measurement system. And I saw more change in 1999 than I saw my whole entire career. When big companies inspect stuff, but very simple. Now, the other thing I did, since I was an equipment manufacturer and designer, is I did reverse conflict of interest. I bent over backwards to not shove any expensive equipment down their throat. We took some shabby old dumps and we made them work with simple changes like non-slip flooring, changing the lighting. Cattle don't like to go into the dark, training the people, moving smaller bunches of animals. Very, very simple things. And out of 74 plants, only 3 out of 74 had to buy expensive equipment. And I'm very proud of that. And I used all my design ability to make the simple changes. And I have the same approach with autism. I talk to families where there's no services. Well, then you need to enlist the grandmothers in the neighborhood through your church group to start working with this 3-year-old. And here are some books and videos that could be helpful. Got to start working on them now. The worst thing you can do is just let them zone out on phones. That's the thing not to do.
What's your dream come true?
Well, I just want to help train the next generation. You see, much more basic and applied. And the thing that I did back in 1999 with McDonald's, Wendy's, and Burger King, back in the 70s, that would have been beyond my wildest dreams. McDonald's bought from just about every big meatpacking plant. There were a couple of exceptions. What was interesting about the McDonald's supplier list then was who was not on it. It was a plant that had a history of food safety problems. They were never on the list. But when big corporations can really make change. Also, I wasn't asking of the plant to go out there. It was very clear what they had to achieve. They had to make certain numbers. If you couldn't make 95% of those cattle unconscious on a single shot, you'd get booted off the list. So what did you have to do to fix that? Maintain your equipment. Manage your stuff and maintain it. You see, it was very clear exactly what was expected. And I had all three of them enforcing the same thing.
I think it's not an exaggeration to say your life, what you're living, is truly you are living your dream. It is the perfect dream.
Well, and I want to help, but the thing I'm learning is the world's getting more verbal now. And I'm amazed at just how much overgeneralization there is. And also the things I worked on were targeted things. Okay, back in 1999, it was improving animal welfare at beef and pork slaughter plants. Again, that is something that's targeted. It's not saying, well, today people say, well, the whole world's terrible and unjust. That's too vague. Work on something specific and you'll be a lot more effective.
And that's how you become truly a game changer and a change maker for positive, for the betterment of humanity. And I think there's no better one than actually exemplify you and to bring you to the young generation and precisely what you're doing.
Well,
so you're truly a gift.
That's what I'm trying to do. Also, I emphasize the practical. What are practical things that a mom can do? Okay, she's got a kid that's not talking. All right, no services. Certain parts of the country, there's no services. And what can that mom do? Well, if you have a 3-year-old who's not talking, the worst thing you do is nothing. So what can we do? Well, there's some books you can buy, some videos you can look at, and you go to your church and you ask the grandmothers in the community to help work with this kid. All right, getting the first job. A lot of times that can be done in the community. Somebody has a local store and you put the kid to work there. A lot of people they don't, you see, I visualize sort of examples of stores even right here in Fort Collins, places that would be wonderful, like our Barnes & Noble bookstore would be wonderful. I'll tell you one thing that's terrible at Barnes & Noble, Christmas wrapping station at Barnes & Noble was chaos. And I would not put them on that. And I would not start them at Barnes & Noble at Christmas time. Otherwise, that bookstore would be a perfect place for a verbal autistic person to think. So let's talk about jobs for the different kinds of minds. My kind of mind, skilled trades, art, animals. Now, the thing that worries me about art is AI. Hands-on jobs will not be taken over by AI. All kinds of skilled trade stuff, design work, working with animals. Now, the mathematical minds, computers, well, there's going to be some computer programming stuff that's going to get taken over. Video game design, forget it. AI is going to eat that one alive. But the skilled trade stuff, it's totally safe from AI. I'm watching that all really carefully. Physics, high level. Now, your high level computer programming at the highest level will guide AI. But let's say the programming to make a web page, that's going to get automated. Now, how about the verbal autistic? There's a verbal autistic. We haven't talked about them. They know every fact about everything. Their favorite thing, whether it be baseball statistics, whatever, movie stars, whatever. Now, where they can really shine is what I call quiet, specialized retail. This is a special category I've made because people have told me about where they've been successful selling complicated financial products. I've been on Zoom calls with banks, and they have knowledge of the product, selling phones. Oh, like on a Walmart, and there's like 15 phones. Now they have them tied down so they can't be stolen. But 15 phones there and 3 different calling plans and different SIM cards, and where do you start? Well, that's where an autistic person can help pick out the right phone, not shove the most expensive one down their throat. The right phone plan. Sporting goods has been very successful. Another place for the verbal autistics, selling new cars. There's been 4 or 5 real successes with that. You see, but all of these retail environments, you're working with one customer at a time to pick out the right thing, and they're appreciated for their knowledge of the products. Selling specialized business insurance. These are all actual cases. You would then go, now what do these cases have in common? It's specialized knowledge, one customer at a time, and even in the Walmart, it's, you're just working with the one customer at a time to help pick out the right phone and the right phone plan. So that's where the verbal autistic thinker, the fact thinker. Oh, another one, auto parts store. He memorized every part number in the warehouse. They love them. Okay, those are things that are specific examples, but then I can see that there's a common denominator. I've been in our auto parts stores, and they're pretty quiet. They're not chaotic environments. Most of the time, the Barnes & Noble bookstore would be perfect, but let's stay away from the Christmas wrapping station. That was chaos. You see, and I see it. I remember standing next to the Christmas wrapping station. I'm going, this is where I don't put them. We'll start a job at Barnes & Noble after Christmas. You see, I just see it. I remember thinking that when I was there. You see, and I look at that and I'm going, that's where I don't put them. Chaos. And you're going to wrap the wrong book and give it to the wrong person, and they're going to be mad. The Christmas present's open, then it's the wrong book. I can just visualize that you're going to have a very unhappy customer.
What makes you feel alive?
Well, when I have people come to me at the airport and say, well, my kid's got a job and loving it, and you help get me to do it, that makes me happy. Or somebody I had a person come to me at the airport yesterday and came up to me and said, well, I have a friend that has one of your corral systems. We built it 20 years ago. We're still using it. We love it. Look at it. Let's look at the things you do make a positive change. I'm also extremely logical in how I think.
Professor Temple Grandin, thank you so much for being on the show and to be truly a gift to me and to the world. Truly.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Professor Temple Grandin. That's why knowledge matters. Make your life a masterpiece. Visit now programs.d-ykm.com.